Welcome back to the Digital Seminary. Today we're tackling the question, which gospel was written first? Awesome. This is a great primer on reading horizontally, so I hope you'll stick around. Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a pastor, not a seminary professor, but I did go to seminary, so that kind of makes me an expert, right? I hope this series of videos will help deepen your understanding of Christianity and acquaint you with the kinds of conversations that do happen in seminary, because I think we need to think a little deeper in our churches. Now, in our last video, we talked about the Synoptic Problem and how that helps us answer the question of which gospel was written first. So if you haven't watched that video yet, go do that, okay? And if you did watch it and are a little fuzzy on what we talked about last time, what this synoptic problem is, here's a refresher for you, just real quick. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic means seen together, okay? So do you see the word optic in there? That's right? You got it. You know Greek. You pass. They are called this because these three Gospels are remarkably similar. They tell the same stories about Jesus in roughly the same order. All in all, over 90% of Mark is found in Matthew and Luke in both. What's the problem then, you ask? Well, the problem is in understanding why these three Gospels agree so closely so much of the time and yet disagree so widely at other times. And we're going to see that this helps us to understand which gospel was written first. But first, a little history. For most of Christian history, it was believed that Matthew was written first. Irenaeus, late in the 2nd century, tells us that Matthew was written first. All the church fathers really weighed in on this, and the consensus was that Matthew was written first in Hebrew, and then Mark and Luke, and then John. Now, Augustine supported this tradition as well. Augustine, however, added that Mark and Luke used Matthew's gospel as a source for their own gospel, and that's why they are so similar. But you wonder, if Mark copied off of Matthew, then why is Mark nearly half of Matthew's size? Now, to Augustine, it's because Mark was simply an abridgment of Matthew. Luke then used Mark and Matthew to write his gospel, and John's still just doing his own thing, man, just chilling. It wasn't until the 1700s that people really started questioning Augustine and Irenaeus and the church fathers on this point. Why? Because they began reading the Bible horizontally and noticed some really interesting patterns. Let me explain. Imagine the four Gospels are side by side on your desk. We tend to read them vertically. We read vertically when we read from Matthew 1 to Matthew 28. We read horizontally when we read Matthew 1 and Mark 1 and Luke 1. Okay? Now, when these early scholars began reading horizontally, they discovered that it was very rare that Matthew and Luke ever perfectly agree where Mark disagrees. Almost all of the time, Matthew and Mark will agree and Luke will disagree, or Mark and Luke will agree and Matthew will disagree, or all three will agree, or all three will disagree. But Matthew and Luke rarely agree against Mark. Now, that suggests that Mark was the source for Matthew and Luke. And for Mark to be the source, it must have been written first. Furthermore, Matthew and Luke follow the narrative outline of Mark. There's John the Baptist, and then there's Jesus' baptism, and then Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. All three Gospels have these things. But of course, Matthew and Luke add a bunch of other material, like the birth of Jesus, the genealogies, the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, and all that stuff that's not found in Mark. What's interesting is that whenever they follow Mark very closely. But whenever they add their own material, Matthew and Luke add them in different places. Matthew's gospel begins with a genealogy. Luke's gospel begins with a birth story and doesn't get to the genealogy until chapter 3. Now, the basic story that Matthew and Luke are telling is Mark's story. They just add things to fill out the story. And when they add things, Matthew and Luke add them in different places, almost all of the time. Mark doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount or a birth story, so Matthew and Luke had to figure out where to place those stories in their narrative, in Mark's narrative. So Naturally, they placed those materials in different places. It would be very unlikely that they would place them all in the same places in Matthew and in Luke. And that's exactly what you would expect to find if both of them were using Mark as a source. Look at it another way. Let's say Matthew was written first. That means Mark would have cut out a ton of Matthew's content, but the cut wasn't even because Mark has very few of the sayings of Jesus. He has a lot of the Jesus went and did this and healed this and did that, but he doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, like I said. So why did Mark cut out so much of the sayings and teachings of Jesus but kept the other stuff? We would have to answer that question. But the second implication is that Luke did preserve the teachings and sayings of Jesus found in Matthew, but for some reason would have rearranged them? That's a really hard knot to untangle. But that's why we think Mark was written first. And here's another reason. Mark's Greek is sometimes called poor, but that's a bit unfair. It is true that he used some awkward language, some, maybe not the best word for the job. If Mark was copying Matthew's Greek or Luke's Greek, then why would Mark change their nice words for his odd words or sometimes not as pleasant words? It's more likely that Matthew and Luke smoothed over Mark's awkward phrases than it is that Mark intentionally made Matthew's Greek worse. Oh, here's a final reason for why Mark was written first. When Matthew and Mark tell the same story, Mark's account is usually longer. That suggests that Mark isn't an abridgment of Matthew. Matthew actually is an abridgment of Mark, but then Matthew adds a bunch of other stuff, so his gospel is longer in the end. Now, these are reasons why most scholars think Mark was the first written gospel that we have, at least. There are some that still hold on to Matthew, but it's a minority of scholars. In technical terms, this is called the Markan priority. That is, Mark came first. Is this going to deeply impact your salvation? Probably not. But why is that always the benchmark for everything? I mean, isn't learning things about God and the Bible good for its own sake? But there is an opportunity here for some fruitful study in your own spiritual life. Try reading the Gospels horizontally and see what happens. Pay attention to the similarities and differences and how they affect the meaning. What does Matthew emphasize that Luke doesn't? Now, you could spend a lifetime doing this, just studying the Bible in this way, going word by word, verse by verse. But even doing it a month, maybe 2 months, 3 months, will help you understand the unique nature of each gospel and how it paints this picture of Jesus. In a larger sense, of course, the Gospels are one story about Jesus' life and death and resurrection, but they're also 4 individual stories. Mark is trying to say something that is a little bit different than Matthew and Luke and John, and it's worth taking the time to listen to what they all have to say and learn how to hear their individual voices, learn how to taste their individual flavors. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me today in this duo series of videos. Who knows, maybe we'll add a third video to this series on the Gospels and how they were written and all that kind of stuff. And maybe we can go in depth into some of the differences between the Gospels, and I can show you some examples of what I've been talking about in these 2 videos. If you want that, let me know in the comments and we'll get that video made for you. If you don't want it, well then don't let me know and we won't make that video. But if you would, subscribe, that would be really helpful. Share it with your friends, you know the drill. And I'll see you next time.